Jonathan was a empowering leader. So God chooses leaders, God grooms his leaders. God chose David in a very interesting way, even though his parents were not sure that David was the right person. Literally, they forgot there was another son. So God chooses leaders. God's eyes goes through the world and nothing is hidden from him. So he is God who rewards the righteous people. And also God grooms his leaders. So God puts them in various situations so that they could be shaped in character, shaped in experience and expertise, shaped to fit in what God wants them to do. So God brings situations in our life. So there could be different situations, difficult situations. So in the midst of those difficult situations, God has a plan, God has a purpose, God has instructions, God has learning experiences. And also God brings people in our life. So people could be who could be our bosses, or could be colleagues, neighbors, friends. Sometimes it may be strangers. And through them, God shapes our life or encourages our life, affirms our life. So in this context, today we are going to see about Jonathan, son of Saul. So Saul was the first king of Israel. David was the second king. So Saul's son, Jonathan, was a leader who empowered David. In a way, what Saul failed to do, what Saul failed to do to David, Jonathan did in a little amount. It was not a full. He could not, because he didn't have authority. So if Saul would have known God's will and if he would have surrendered to do God's will, he would have gladly accepted. So Jonathan had a heroic faith. If you see 1 Samuel 14:6, there was always war between Philistines and Israel. So they had border tensions, they had wars, and later stage David comes into scene to fight Goliath. So earlier, that is 1 Samuel 14, because David comes in 1 Samuel 17 to face Goliath. So they were having fight and the Israel army was in one side and that army was on another side. So the garrison of Philistine was in a mountainous region. So Jonathan had an amazing faith. So he says, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Actually, he and his armor bearer, only two of them, are going to face a outpost, we can say, or a small camp where maybe 20 soldiers were there. So he said, Lord can save us. He doesn't look at the number of people. He is not favoring a majority opinion. There are a small crowd of people who are committed to him, believe in him, God can use them. So that's the faith of Jonathan was. So just he and his armor bearer raided Philistine outpost and they killed about 20 people. So this we have to understand. If you want to stand for truth, if you want to stand for justice, if you want to stand for righteousness, so if you want to do the will of God, you may be alone. So that does not hinder God from working. So God is always at work and God can work through a few people. So we see that in Gideon's life. So God chose only a few, not the big army. Then here we see he was a courageous hero. If you see 1 Samuel 14, it is an interesting chapter. Saul wanted to establish himself as a super spiritual leader. So how can he establish himself not only as a political military leader? He wanted to establish himself as a spiritual leader, so that he wins back the favor of God. So, or he wanted to show the people he was very pious. So what he says is, unless Saul and his army gets victory over Philistine, nobody should taste any food. It is interesting. So how can an army fight a battle with empty stomach? So army cannot fight war with empty stomachs. So that's what he did. You should not taste any food. That means you go to fight a physical war, a military war in empty stomach. And Jonathan did not know that. So he saw a honeycomb and honey was dropping and he just tasted it. And then he came to the notice of Saul, and Saul wanted to show himself he was very committed to the oath. So he wanted to kill Jonathan, but he was saved by the people. People said, so God was with Jonathan, so only he got victory in the war, so he cannot be executed. So Saul backed off. So he had the courage to empower other people. What is empowerment? Empower means giving affirmation. Yes, God is doing great job through you. That is affirming God's call in their life. Affirming that what they are doing is right. So Paul also needed such affirmation. If you read that he said, I wanted to make sure that I don't run in vain. So that means he needed an affirmation. So who gave the affirmation? So the apostles who were before me, they gave me the right hand of fellowship. So that means Peter and others gave him affirmation. Yes, what you are doing is right. Reaching out Gentiles is important. So your testimony is good. So do we give affirmation to leaders who are emerging? Many times it is not affirmation. Sometimes we discourage them. Affirmation, encouragement is needed. And also affection. They should not be treated like strangers. So Saul wanted to treat David like a stranger, not as a fellow colleague or not as a servant in the same army of God. So he didn't have that kind of intention, but Jonathan had it. So empower means giving power, sharing power, delegating power, distributing power, distributing resources. Some people say, okay, you do this, but they won't give resources. They won't give budget. So they will say, do this, but they will not give authority to do. So that time they are not empowered, they are actually paralyzed. So many leaders paralyze younger leaders by giving them job, but not giving them resources, not giving them training, not giving them opportunities. So equipping them is also very important. So Jonathan equipped David. We'll be seeing how he equipped David. So Jonathan endorses and empowers. So if you read 1 Samuel 18, 1-4. So Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and belt. It is interesting. So he gave the robe. So maybe David had robe earlier also, but it is not about just giving. It is honoring. It is recognizing. So by giving his robe, Jonathan endorsed him as a leader, a military hero, and political king. So Jonathan discerned David not just as a shepherd boy, not just as a musician who came to play music to cast off the evil spirit when Saul was tormented. So he saw beyond that. So though Jonathan had the authority because he was a prince, he was next in line to be the king. He had all those like robe, tunic and everything, but he was willing to give that off. So it was a indeed a sacrificial giving. So it was an act of sacrifice. So not only the robe and other things, like when prodigal son returned, father gave him a great embrace and also gave him new robe and uh, the ring for his fingers. So that all were endorsement or affirmation. In the same way, Jonathan affirms, encourages, or says, "You are the great leader for the nation of Israel." So it is significant as there were only two swords in Israel. If you see 1 Samuel 13:22. So the whole nation had only two swords. Maybe they fought wars with lathis, maybe stakes and bows and arrows. So sword was not very common. So there was only two. One was with Saul and one was with Jonathan. So when Jonathan gives to David, so that means a lot. So it is a precious, it is a rare thing, and it is a sign of authority. So when that means after Jonathan had given it to David, it means only two people, Saul and David, will have the swords. So it was, he is leaving his position, or he is willing to give the position to other person. He was willing to sacrifice his place for the sake of David. So we see it's an amazing testimony of how Jonathan was involved or shaped the life of David. Then discernment. So Jonathan had a discernment which Saul did not have. So he said David will be the king. Jonathan would be the deputy. That means he'll be second in place, maybe a commander or a prime minister. So he was able to discern God's will. God has chosen David, and Jonathan was able to see that. But Saul did not discern it. He was blinded by selfishness and stubbornness. He also rebuked Jonathan for being friendly with David. He said, if you are friendly with David, you don't understand. You cannot become the king. You will not be my successor. As long as he is alive, there is a danger for you. But Jonathan did not see that. He didn't see risk or danger. He saw God's sovereign authority and will and rule. So Jonathan surrendered to God's authority. Saul was rebelling against God's authority. And it was a loving friendship. So Psalms 133:1 we read, "Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity." So they were having a sweet fellowship where they could love the Lord together, be loyal to one another, and think about God's work and the future of the kingdom. So it was a joyful fellowship they could enjoy. Then affirmation and covenant. So 1 Samuel 23:17 and 18, two of them made a covenant before the Lord. So it is interesting. Yes, they were friends, they were sacrificial friends, and Jonathan gave his robe and other things. So later, that fellowship and friendship mature. So they come to a relationship of covenant. So they made covenant before the Lord. So covenant means what? Covenant means it is very deep relationship. So in the Old Testament period, when they made covenant, so usually they made a sacrifice. One animal was cut lengthwise into two. So that means two long pieces. Then these long pieces were cut into smaller pieces, maybe 4 pieces. So that means one animal will be cut into 8 pieces. and two rows, they'll keep four pieces. So both the people who are making covenant, they have to keep the both hands on their head and walk between all these pieces, saying, if I violate the covenant, let me be killed like this animal. So both the parties will walk in between the pieces of flesh of the killed animal. So that means that is what the covenant of blood. They make a covenant. If they violate it, they could be killed. So the judgment will be, consequence will be, they will be killed. Death penalty will be there. So only they made a covenant before the Lord. That means they are telling the Lord, if one of us, if anyone, whether it is Jonathan or David, violate the covenant at any point of time in the future, God can kill them. God can punish them. So that is the covenant they made. So this covenant was known to others also. So very interestingly, Saul knew it. When Saul came to know it, he became insecure. If you read 1 Samuel 22:8, he was annoyed that Jonathan made covenant with David without his knowledge. So Jonathan made a covenant without telling his father. So when Saul came to know about it, he was very angry. So and then he tells other people. So the people, especially it was in a city where there were only priests, where David ran for his life. There he says to the priest, you see, my son is making covenant with David and nobody is telling me. So that means he blames the whole population and the whole group of people. So you are siding with David and you are conspiring against me. So Saul was very insecure, but Jonathan was very confident that he made a covenant with David. So he protested when there was injustice and he tried to protect David. So he had the courage and conviction. So Saul wanted to put him to death. So he was very angry. So Jonathan had the courage to ask, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father, 1 Samuel 20:32. He had the courage and guts to stand for the rights of the people who were voiceless. So David was powerless, voiceless. So the whole Saul and his army was against him. So David was targeted. So David was targeted without any reason. So there was injustice. So Jonathan, even he was a son, he did not side with his father. So he stood for truth and righteousness, not for blood relationships. So today in the world, even among the Christians, even among the churches, we see we don't stand for truth. We don't stand for righteousness. We favor somebody because he is of my king's group or he is my relative. So even if he has done wrong, that is fine because he is my relative. He is my cousin, he is my nephew, or he belongs to my same village, or we say he belongs to my same state. So Jonathan did not do that. Truth is truth, righteousness is righteousness. So whoever is not doing justice or righteousness should be opposed. And Jonathan had the guts and courage to protest, and he protected David. So Jonathan played a great role in the life of David. So some scholars compare Jonathan to John the Baptist. John the Baptist prepared the way for the King of Kings, for the Lord. So he prepared the hearts and the minds of the people, especially the nation of Israel, to receive the Messiah. So in the same way, Jonathan paved the way for David a man according to God's heart, a man who would be acclaimed, or man who would be given a status that his kingdom and his genealogy will have the Messiah. So Jonathan recognized that, and he prepared the way for David to become the king of the nation of Israel. Of course, David was one of the powerful kings of Israel, and his time is known as the golden era for nation of Israel. So he gave robes, sword, and made covenant. So that is the way he prepared. So Jonathan's death was, along with his two brothers, the battle against Philistine. So it was a very sad death, and all of them fell in Mount Gilboa at the same time. So in 2 Samuel 1, 25, 26, the part of the song, or the we can say the poetry David wrote, Jonathan lies lying on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. So he was so pained in his heart, and he lost his dear friend, who was knitted together in love, in loyalty, sincerity, in worshipping the Lord, in discerning God's will, making covenant. Maybe if they would have been together, they could have made Israel strong. So Jonathan died when David later becomes the king of Israel. So David fulfills the covenant. If you read 2 Samuel 9, 1 to 13, Mephibosheth was one of the sons of Jonathan. So when Saul died and Jonathan died, so this fellow was a small boy. They tried to carry him when they were rushing to save their lives. So he fell down, he became lame. But David invited him and allowed him to sit in the royal table. So he showed mercy for Jonathan's sake. So this is a picture or a type that God, Lord, allows us to come into His table. So though we don't deserve it, because of the covenant of the blood that Lord Jesus Christ shed on the cross of Calvary, we are invited to partake in the table with the Lord and to be in the feast with the Lord in heavens forever and ever. So David was gracious. So he remembered the covenant. He was gracious. Even though he was a lame, he allowed him to be part of his family. And that was a great thing that David did. So the challenge is, we need discernment like Jonathan did. Do we discern people around us? Do we discern the potentials? Do we discern the future achievements, accomplishments? So Jonathan was able to discern David as the great king. And faith in God's plan. So he did not want to grab the throne, but had faith in God's sovereign plan. If God chose David, it is his decision. God had the right to choose anybody to be the king. So he did not claim that he should be the king, and David should not be that. So the faith in God's sovereign authority, God's sovereign plan. And he was doing God's will by making covenant with him, and he honored God's anointed, because God had anointed David. And he was empowering others. He protested injustice, and he had a covenant relationship with David. So we learned that Jonathan was a great leader, empowering leader. He may not have position like David did or Solomon did, but in his sphere of influence, in his area of influence. So he was a leader who helped David to be shaped by God for greater purposes. So the challenge would be we should be like Jonathan. So we should be affirming Davids in our lives. There could be many who need that kind of affirmation. Are we providing affirmation, encouragement, and even do we have a common relationship with them? Or we are discouraging them? Or we are indifferent to them? So we could be indifferent, or we could be discouraging them, or sometimes we can be hostile. Like Saul was very much against David. So there are leaders who don't like some younger leaders emerging and they want to be keeping them away from leadership position. So Jonathan is a great model, and Jonathan, we should be like Jonathan. So that is the study we are doing for the character study.